Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this session, which, as Miles says, is entitled Talent for the Future, Driving Innovation and Maintaining Competitiveness. Well, we'll be getting down to nuts and bolts, looking at the challenge facing the industry and how some, particularly the firms that some of our panellists advise or run, how they're tackling it. My name's David Wighton, and I have a terrific panel here, so I won't say very much because these people know what they're talking about, and Miles has introduced them, so I think we should crack on. But I have been writing about financial services for a very long time, and have seen the cycle that Bruce Carnegie Brown mentioned of particularly 20 or 30 years ago, when you would, if you talk to, 20 years ago, if you talk to a financial services leader and ask them about training, you would tend to get a bit of a glazed expression and then they'd change the subject. And that is not the case now, where and some of it may be window dressing, and some of it may be them knowing that they should be very engaged with skills. But it does seem to me, as an outsider, that it has shot up the agenda at board level and executive committee level. I think those firms that didn't get it got a bit of a shock during after the pandemic, when we had this acute labour shortage and people were suddenly panicking about where they were going to get their talent from. And I did, a very senior banker I talked to a while ago said that in the old days they used to develop their technology in-house but buy in their talent, and now he was increasingly buying in the technology and building the talent. But while things have certainly improved, the challenge is pretty daunting, I have to say, as an outsider. And we were just talking about Andy Haldane, the former chief economist of the Bank of England, who's had some very tough things to say about training in the UK generally, where we are a laggard on the European scale, and on some measures financial services still doesn't do very well. But if you think it's challenging in financial services, you should try doing it in journalism, where I know it's even more challenging. And I have to say, I don't think many colleagues of my generation would be wearing those badges showing how much training you'd had. Anyway, let's hear from the people who know what they're talking about and have been very much engaged both in their own firms and in advising other firms. And could I start, Anna, with you, to sort of sketch out how you see the progress that's been made so far, and are we getting there?
I'm going to say yes and no. So maybe before we look forward, it might be worth taking a little step back, and then we can reflect on how far we've come, but probably what we still need to do. So I think the Skills Task Force report back in 2020, I think, was a wake-up call for this industry. It certainly was for me when you looked at some of the data in that, showing how big the skills gap was and the trend of how that was going to continue for financial services unless it was addressed. When you looked at some of the data in that, the dependency on highly skilled workers was growing. The industry was competing quite heavily with tech companies in a way it never had before with talent, and I would argue at that point was losing that battle. And as you've already mentioned, significantly underinvesting in training. So it was the third lowest of all sectors in terms of investment in training for employees back in 2020, which is quite shocking, I would say. If you fast forward to the latest report, there's definitely some progress in that. So We've moved from only about 50% of financial services firms actually forecasting their skills gap, which is a big bit of this. If you followed the work of the Commission, forecasting is a huge part of that. That has moved from 50% of firms to over 80% of firms now forecasting, which is a huge step forward. Investment training has gone up 32%. That's also really encouraging. I would say there's still more to do on that, and we can talk about that a bit. And the competition on talent has become a bit easier, but I might argue for the wrong reasons. I think that's more about the economy than necessarily the industry doing more than the tech companies. I think there's just been a shift in the wider economy. So I think in the last few years we've made progress, but there are still gaps. We know, and you'll have seen if you look at the little brochures on your desk, the number of people in the financial services workforce that still need upskilling is substantial. It's about 160,000 people in the UK that need upskilling. And that is a huge endeavour, and probably what we'll talk about a bit more on this panel, so I won't waffle on anymore.
Nishma, can I then move on to, to the outsider, it does look a pretty daunting challenge. I mean, it's tough in a steady state. And we're so far from a steady state. I mean, thinking about, we were talking in earlier sessions about forecasting your needs. And I find it, I mean, boy, is that a hard job. Thinking what your needs are going to be when we have very little grasp on the impact of, well, Sharon was saying that AI is history and it's all quantum computing now, for goodness sake. But how on earth do you cope with those challenges coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, so David, I think there are three major challenges that we face as an industry, and unsurprisingly, you know, the conversation that permeated the corridors of Davos across every financial services organisation at the moment is the implementation of AI, both from a cost and productivity perspective, but also embedding it into products. Now, the issue with this at the moment, which also brings me on to the second challenge, because I think they're both combined, is that we do not have, as an industry, enough data scientists to go around. We do not have enough technology stack engineers. And if we look at those leaving university age 21 to what the workforce actually needs, there's a huge gap. And it doesn't matter what we do at this stage, even if we were to push secondary education that way, we're not going to be able to meet the demand. So I strongly believe that there is a role for corporates and government and education, and the three of them have to come together very quickly to be able to bridge this gap, or we will not remain competitive as a sector versus our European counterparts, and certainly not the US. So we really need to reshape and rethink how we're going to bring that together. And I think a lot of financial services institutions, particularly the wholesale banks, have put their hands up to do that. And we're seeing, you know, the likes of Citi, for example, establishing universities with governments in Ireland, with the Irish government, to enable some of that moving forward. And I think the third issue that organisations are grappling with at the moment, and certainly I mean, I lead our organisation practice at Bain within financial services, and the conversations I'm having with senior executives is very much the employee value proposition has not changed in line with what 21-year-olds are demanding of financial services institutions when they leave. And what I mean by that is that they are looking for a portfolio career. They're not looking to make managing director, many of them. They're looking for a very bespoke product, and we're talking about, you know, the disruption of technology and AI and what that's actually going to do on a industry that's very used to pyramids and structures that have been around for decades. And what AI is actually going to do is take that pyramid and squeeze it into a square. And the industry will be shaped very differently as a result of AI. Hierarchies will have to go to enable the transition and the change. And the employee value proposition isn't going to meet that. So, there's quite a lot of work to be done on that as well, end to end, to be able to meet the demand. And as Anna said, there are many that don't want to join the industry anymore, and actually they want to go to, other industries where they believe that they can understand the value, the purpose of the institution. And so how do we bridge that to ensure that the employee value proposition meets the technological disruption and demand in an industry that's moving extremely quickly?
Let's drill further down into the demand for data scientists, and because Dan, you're at the sharp end here, running a team of 80. How do you attract people, train them, and how are you looking at the challenges you're going to face in the next few years?
Yeah,
and can we start to address the big question of women as well?
Yeah, and I think this comes down to, firstly, what are you asking from for your data science team in this particular example, but also where are you looking to try and bring in and develop that talent? So, as I said, my background's in data scientist. I joined Capital One as a data scientist back in 2000. And I think the lazy way to develop a data science team is to just go and hire a load of PhDs from computer science or data science. Job done. Now, the problem with that is, firstly, you're only going to get one type of thinking there. You're going to get very deep technical understanding, but that may not necessarily land in your organisation or bring together the various different teams that you're going to need to actually have successful applications of data science. The other aspect of that is that will represent the population who are doing PhDs in computer science and mathematics, data science. And if we look at university numbers, that's heavily skewed towards male. I don't think that's the approach that you need to be taking in order to build an effective data science function. What you really need to be building is a team, and that team needs to reflect the wide variety of skills that a successful data scientist has. Not just that deep technical expertise, but also how do you work with other stakeholders to effectively deliver on time? How do you focus on what the actual business need is? How do you communicate those results? A wide variety of different skills that are needed there. The approach that we've looked to try and take at Capital One is to think about what are the different channels by which we can actually attract people into those careers. There is still a place for going out and that graduate and PhD hiring, but more and more we're seeing the opportunity is, firstly, let's look at our existing employee base. There's a whole load of people who really understand our business, really get the interactions with our customers and understand our processes, and have a real curiosity for learning new things and building better processes. If we can focus on that population, whether that's through apprenticeships, whether that's through making available roles within the data team, that's a great way of bringing that insight in. And actually, you can partner those people with the people who have those deep technical skills and actually build up both sides so that you end up with a much more rounded team. And by the way, if you do that, you end up with a way more diverse data science team that is much more effective at solving business problems.
And stickier, presumably easier to retain than just hiring some hotshot who then can be hired as a hotshot.
Absolutely. You're building a really deep link to the organisation. You're demonstrating to your employees that you care about their future career development and building out those skills that Anna talked about. That naturally leads to much more stickiness.
Can I just add on to that, I think, to Nishma's point, because we do looking at something similar. When you look at a generation that wants a portfolio career, that doesn't necessarily mean with different organisations. So there is an opportunity, I think, to roll a portfolio within a company to give people that answer without losing them entirely.
Okay, we'll come back to those all those issues in a moment. I'd just like to bring in Alasdair, who runs a startup, really, well, maturing startup now, but you must have faced particular challenges running a startup needing highly skilled specialist people, and you can't wait for years to train them up, but it's also you didn't have masses of money to pay top dollar to get them. Tell us about your experience.
Well, I look at this in completely the other end of the spectrum, which is, we are not a startup today, but we actually 1 in 20 transactions across the whole of Europe is transacted on Aquis exchange. So we're an important part of market structure today. But when we founded the business, you're always slightly mad to want to found a challenger stock exchange. And what is a stock exchange? It is a utility, it manages message traffic, and it's a fintech business. And I believe that skills are transferable, but jobs are not. So when we founded this business, how do you attract the highest quality? And when we talk about companies here that have literally tens of thousands of people, we have just under 100 people. And when we started, we had about 10 or 15 people. How do you attract the skills that are absolutely essential? And the important thing with this is you have to get people with broad skills. And they don't necessarily, and I'm sorry for everybody who's working in financial services, which is most of us, it is a lot easier to teach people financial services than it is actually to get the skills from other industries to join financial services. So in other words, what we did, we looked at the transferability of skills by taking somebody from the European Space Agency. We're a networking business. We took a lot of people out of the telecoms industry. We actually took people out of the film and entertainment industry, and we taught them what a bid and offer was. It was much more effective than having to pay up, and a name like Alasdair and a brother called Haynes. There's a Scottish ancestry, so we have particularly deep pockets. We don't necessarily want to go and pay a lot of money to go and take somebody out of Goldman Sachs, whereas actually we can train somebody. Now the next part is, how do you get that skill set transferability within your company, not just from outside the industry to your company? And the way you do that is, first of all, you get skills protectionism. Somebody comes in with a tremendous skill and they think they're paid a lot of money because they have that skill. That's the first thing you have to break down, because what you want to do is make quite certain that that person is training other people around them. We've seen it with salespeople. They're my clients. You're not going to talk to them. We see it in journalists. It's my story. Nobody else is going to have that. So what you have to do is make quite certain that the skill that that individual has is passed. If you want to get paid at Aquis, teach your skills to other people. If you don't want to get paid at Aquis, be a protectionist and keep it to yourself. And we have all these things like lunch and learn every week, or every month we have a lunch and learn session where we call people in, people within the company, people outside in the industry, to come in and give their experience so that we can actually learn and educate. And you have to. If you're a 100-person company and you're dealing with the Goliath businesses, you have to look at things in a very, very different way. And that is what I think has made us the success story, and we've become the 7th largest exchange in Europe today now, and one of the biggest technology providers in the world in exchange technology. And it's done because of the skills. In the future, I promise you one thing: you will hire for skill, you will not hire for the role.
Anna, can we go back to the thank you, Alasdair, that's really interesting. Can we go back to the women pipeline issue? How are we doing, and how can we do better? Because we're clearly not doing that well. And how does it, when there's a lot of coverage, I write stuff myself about what's happening at the top of companies, and how is that reflecting people's efforts further down, and how does it link to efforts further down?
Yes, so we are doing better, but we are definitely not done, would be my summary. And so one of the things we look at, to your point, in some of the research we do, is what is the diversity at the top of your organisation, because that in some way influences the tone and the opportunity in the rest of your organisation. And there has definitely been progress there. So we look at this across European financial services. And at board level, across European financial services, it's currently 57% male, 43% female, which as a headline statistic, I would argue, is not bad and is a lot better than it was. However, if you drill into that number, you will find a lot of the women hold non-executive positions, which generally are a position of less influence, I would argue, particularly on the culture of an organisation. And when we look at the most recent appointments in the last year, so in 2022, over 60% of new appointments on boards of financial services were women. Good news. Last year, that dropped to 31%. That held the number the same, but that's a big drop in 1 year. And when you look at what were the underlying causes of that, one of the big things being looked for currently in board roles is C-suite experience and tech skills. And when you look then at the population that people are selecting from, it narrows in the female one. And I think this really links to the point that you were making, Alasdair, that I think we need to think a bit more broadly about what we mean by skills. Because if you interpret skills to experience, and your experience requirement is C-suite, by definition, when you look at the stats, your pool of women is going to be small. If you look at skills and say, has this person had a role where they can manage senior stakeholders, where they can interact with lots of different people, where they can, you could look much more broadly and have someone who has the skills of a C-suite, even if they've never been in the C-suite. So I think we have to start thinking very differently around what skills do people need to do jobs, rather than what experience have they had historically. And I think that might take us towards a slightly different answer. And if you can start to change the diversity at the top of your organisation, I think you can then start to influence the diversity all the way through your organisation. You have to do it from both. I could talk about this forever, because you can also do it from bottom up. But yeah, I'll answer your question top down.
The same issue applies further down in terms of experience and skills.
It does, and I think a lot of companies for a long time have had targets around gender representation at every level in the organisation. The issue with that is it just takes a long time to come to fruition. I would say most companies manage to hire 50-50 at graduate level, or sometimes actually we're better than that in terms of fit. But by the time you get to the top of the organisation, you have diluted. And that period of time is long. So I think we need to start intervening at every level if we're going to make change faster.
I mean, I absolutely 100% agree with what you say. The issue tends to come in the fintech business. If you look at graduates and who are coming out available to hire, the amount of women who are graduating, it's getting better, but it's nowhere nearly at the point that I think you made, at the level of demand. So you have this massive supply and demand problem. So it is all about getting education at a very, very early stage. We do some work with some South London schools, and we are shocked at the amount of people, when we look at the classrooms of maybe 50 people doing economics. Last year, there were only 4 girls in that class. The rest were all boys. It was a shocking state of affairs. And you've got to think, why did they pick that? You know, economics should be something which really does get a broad gender diversity, but it's not. So there is a problem there that needs to be tackled at the school level, even before university level.
Nishma, and any things that you've found firms or your clients who are doing particularly well, anything that you'd point to?
Yeah. So many of you will have seen the Women in Finance Charter Blueprint, which Bain was commissioned to write alongside Amanda Blanc, the chief executive of Aviva. We worked with 50 chief executives and the Treasury to develop the research. Now, there are 4 sort of broad categories under which we think there are some quick wins for institutions to start moving this. So the stats tell us that the numbers have dropped. They've gone the other way. And actually, if we continue at this rate, we won't reach gender parity until 2050, which frankly is appalling across our industry. And our industry lags behind the others, and that won't be surprising to many of you. So the framework is split into 4: recruitment, retention, promotion, and culture and behaviour change. Now, a lot of the emphasis in the blueprint is very much around culture and behaviour change. As Anna mentioned, we are seeing most graduate employers at 50-50, certainly at the bottom level. The issue at the top is that whilst there are many more in the C-suite, and the FCA has recently, after sort of a long consultation period through the pandemic, issued its diversity and inclusion paper where it's requesting 30% of women on boards, and that would no doubt drop to excos as well, is that at that C level, the majority of the positions held by women are still very much in functional roles, so the CHRO, or the coup, for example, rather than P&L holders. And of course, we know in our industry, to get to chief executive, you still need to have a P&L responsibility. So that is fundamentally an issue, although I know in some organisations that has recently changed. And then to the point that was made earlier, if you look at the stats around FTSE 100, for example, if one woman obviously drops off, and we saw Alison Rose from NatWest last year, that then impacts the numbers dramatically, and obviously we've then seen a dip. What we're seeing, though, is that the industry for the first time is collaborating. So subsects of the industry, wholesale banking, retail banking, asset management, fintechs, etc., are collaborating because they recognise that this is now an industry issue, so Goldman's need to speak to Morgan's and Bank of America. What we also know is that the same women are being moved around at the most senior levels by some very naughty headhunters. So that is not helping the issue, because obviously once you move into a new organisation, it takes you a year to redevelop by the time you then make a promotion. So, you know, certainly we've seen a lot of that, and we're trying to put a stop to that collectively as a task force, which Amanda leads. The Treasury Select Committee is due to issue their report this week. You'll know that just before Christmas, there was an inquiry into sexism in the city, which is stating that actually things really haven't moved since 2018. Which is very worrying. So there are lots of different things here, but a couple of quick wins which I'll leave you with, which of course are in the blueprint, are things like, if your organisation is still undertaking an employee survey on an annual basis, you might as well not bother. That has to really move to weekly pulse surveys, where you're able to establish whether a female member of the team is going to leave, and not wait until they've emotionally checked out when you receive your survey results 6 months later. There are things like consistent recruitment. So every single time a role comes up, somebody will want to recruit somebody that looks like them, feels like them, and actually it's the quickest thing to do. And it needs an intervention for someone to say, we need to go through the process. I need to understand if it's a non-diverse hire, why we're making this decision. And actually that shortlist needs to be thought about a few times by different executives. And then on culture and behaviour change, we made some very dramatic statements actually, which caught the attention of the press, as you may have seen last year, which were focused around zero tolerance in the boardroom. So an intervention that's required by the chair and the chief executive when P&L holders are not role modelling the behaviours that you would expect. And I think it's a combination of process, compliance, and culture and behaviour change that's really going to change the industry.
Can we go from the top back to the cold face, Dan? And interested in how you attract more women into data science, and how you, and whether you think they're not going to want to stay in data science forever. They may want to go into leadership roles, or how does that all work?
I think to some extent it's about how you talk about the role, the skills involved in that. So if I give you an example, so when I was hired by Capital One back in 2000, data scientist didn't exist. It wasn't a thing. I was hired as a statistician. And if you look at roles that are advertised as a statistician role, you end up seeing a much more gender balanced distribution of people who are applying for those roles. If you move to language that is much more data science, computer science, software engineering focused, then you see big shifts in those distributions. Essentially, the role could be exactly the same. You're asking for very similar skills, very similar behaviours, but the way that you talk about that, the way that you advertise those roles can have a really big impact on the distribution of people who apply for that role. So there's something definitely around the language and the way that you advertise those roles. I think it's also really important to think about what's the process like as people go through applying for those roles. Are they able to see a diverse range of interviewers that give them a good understanding of that this is important, this matters, and actually it is really important that you see multiple different people from different backgrounds as part of that candidate experience. So I think there's lots of different things you can do there as part of the interview process. But then actually I think that's just the start. The real work starts when people join the organisation. They need to feel like they are included. They need to feel like they have the support from both their peers and management, that they have the opportunity to grow their careers, to try different things, to take some risks maybe. And so it's how do you build that culture that allows for a diverse workforce to thrive together.
We're going to move to questions in 1 second, but can I just ask, Anna, is there any concern that the looser labour market is going to, the sense of urgency will lessen? Because it certainly was concentrating minds when people were really struggling to recruit. Is there any concern there?
From my personal perspective, not really, because I would say whilst we've seen some change in that market, the skills that were in short supply are still in short supply. That piece hasn't changed. And I completely agree with your point on headhunters. When I look at who is targeting my workforce, experienced, highly skilled women are at the top of every headhunters list. Everybody wants to hire a diverse workforce. So, and again, we might get this in questions, but strategies about how you retain the brilliant women that you have and the brilliant data scientists. When you said a team of 80, I was thinking, oh, could I have some, please? I think we need to do a lot more about ensuring you keep the ones you've got, because that is as important as recruiting from the wider market.
Yeah, very good. So let's turn to questions. I'm sorry, we've been talking amongst ourselves too long. Any questions at the back there?
This is a question for Anna and Nishma. As you've talked about the statistics at the top and graduate intakes at the bottom being roughly 50-50. Where do you see the drop-off? And there's a sort of slightly loaded question here, and I've got 2 young children. And speaking amongst my peers, you know, that experience is rarely universally positive for a lot of people when you factor in things like cost of childcare, and it leads to some really difficult decisions that are really uncomfortable having as a couple, but for society as well.
Yeah, I mean, the childcare piece keeps coming up, and there are, you know, the conversations that are ongoing between the government and the task force that's been set up to try and address this. Because fundamentally, the reason why we have less female chief executives or senior executives versus Asia is as a result of childcare. You know, it's not to do with where you started or what your background is, etc. So we have to grapple that one. In terms of the leaky pipeline, as I call it, which is the bit in the middle, those that are the vice president, senior manager grade that we see drop off, I think it's, you know, women you're in direct conflict with your biological clock versus trying to get up the ladder. And there are lots of different initiatives at the moment that are being rolled out, and I think one of the ones that could transform the industry if the take-up is there is global equal parental leave. The issue with it at the moment is that we're only seeing some institutions rolling it out. We've seen the likes of Erica Bourne, who established it at Burberry's, has come to the London Stock Exchange Group, and you've seen the announcement last week in the press. So we're seeing more institutions establish that at the moment. The other problem is that we're not seeing enough people role model it in the institution. So actually, you then get sort of middle management, there isn't the take-up. So those sort of schemes will certainly help. But fundamentally, it is about dealing with childcare.
Yeah, and I might just add a couple of things to that. So we see the drop-off at the same level, that sort of senior manager grade. But I think there is a role for business to play in this as well. In that, in some ways, we are fortunate that a lot of women now have choices. And we are not making it a choice. It is much easier, actually, for them to choose to stop working for a period of time than carry on, because we haven't made it easy enough for them to carry on. I personally think the shift to hybrid working in a lot of places could change this substantially, done in the right way. Done in the wrong way, I think it could actually be detrimental. But done in the right way, with the right level of flexibility, I think we should see that as an opportunity for businesses to change the proposition, because at the moment I think we are not making it a good enough choice for women to stay in the workforce.
There are things, I mean, what we've done recently, and we only have 100 staff, is things like salary sacrifice childcare. We're obviously an age group where we have quite a few, one born yesterday, another baby in the office. So, I mean, it's at that age group. It is so important that you retain those staff, both father and mother. And therefore, what we found is it went down incredibly well by putting in a salary sacrifice for childcare, because it was the economics, I think that was the point you were making, it was the economics that gives a difficult decision. If that economics is made easier, then actually if you're enjoying your job, you will stay there.
Great, thank you very much. Any other questions from the room? Yes.
Right, Anna, hello. Oh yeah, it's working. You mentioned about we need to be braver and think about skill sets that people have got rather than experience. But when we're in financial services, people are generally speaking quite risk averse and don't like to take chances. So how do we sort of break that down and enable people to actually sort of progress in our organisations where they might not have the experience and we've got to take a bit of a risk on them?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I might ask Alasdair to come, because he would probably argue not everyone in financial services is risk averse, given what he's been up to. But you're right, and I think it is about taking risks within safeguards, right? We all work in organisations where we run big risks every single day. We do not work in a risk-free environment. We work in an environment where we have to manage the risk, and I see that in the same way. So you can take a chance on somebody if you ensure that the support around them is there. So one of the things that we have been doing as an organisation is when we hire somebody in, we make the person who hired them equally accountable for their success as the person we hired, particularly the higher levels of the organisation. So there's dual responsibility about making it successful. Because to the points you made earlier, getting someone in the door in the first place is only the start of the journey. Keeping them once they're there is equally important. So I personally think this sort of dual responsibility point is a good one, and being really clear on what it is you expect people to achieve over what time frame. If you bring somebody in who has the skills but not necessarily the experience, they are inevitably going to need some time to learn, if they've come from a different industry into financial services. So I think from my perspective, the risks are manageable as long as you acknowledge they are there when you start.
I would also add to that, it is really important that when you take risk, and I disagree with your point that people in financial services don't take risk. I think they do. I think we need to take a lot more risk, actually. But it's risk and reward. When I started 45 years ago, it was all about risk and reward. Today we have a society that's all about risk. You mustn't take it. It's a dirty word. And I think that is one of the things that needs to change. I'll give you some examples. I also think you need to feel really left field when you're running a business. I've taken somebody on board here that I thought was a high risk before they started. They did their masters from Imperial College at age 16. They'd worked in a quant team for Goldman Sachs at age 15 as an advisor. They wrote a book with their sister age 12. I mean, they were phenomenal, and I had no idea how to manage them. I mean, it's like I'd never seen a CV like it. That is a left field decision to make, and it's a management decision to make that. But actually it's worked out incredibly well. The guy is genius, but he's also very, very personable, and managed correctly is a tremendous asset to your firm. There are plenty of people out there, not quite like that CV, but there are plenty of people out there that we don't hire somebody because they don't fit into the mould. Whereas actually we should be hiring people outside of that mould, because they are the people that probably have better skills, better capability than the traditional CV. I hate the CV, actually. I'm sorry, the headhunters, but the CVs can put a huge amount of people off because you just literally pigeonhole people.
I definitely agree with that, and I think actually, in my mind, the risk should be more on the leadership to be able to allow those opportunities to happen. If someone is taking the bold decision to actually move their career into a different area, they should be 100% supported and given the right skills and background support to be able to go, actually, I'm going to make that shift, but I'm going to do it in a way where I feel like I've got people who've got my back here. I think that's my job as a leader, to create the right culture where that can happen.
Any other questions from the floor? Can I ask a question? We haven't talked that much about AI. I did talk to somebody who must remain nameless, who runs a financial services firm, who said they were so unclear about what this is going to mean for them, what skills they're going to need, that they're kind of throwing their arms up and saying, well, we'll just have to rely on the market. I mean, precisely what you're sort of arguing against. But is there much of that? I could sympathise. I mean, we really have very little idea what the impact's going to be in terms of the number of people we need with the particular skills, isn't that? Alasdair?
Well, I don't think there's any difference. I mean, I'm in my 60s now, and I don't think there's any difference to when calculators suddenly came in. And I remember my parents saying to me, "It's the end of the world. That's it. You know, I've spent all my life trying to teach you tables and how to do them, and nobody's going to need them in the future, and the whole world has changed. It's all awful." And I disagree. I mean, what we became is a far, far more comprehensive society, much more advanced. So generative AI is going to be used. It's the modern calculator. It's the way the world is moving on. We are going to adapt to it. The smart people who adapt will go and do well, and the people who don't adapt to it and sit back and say it's a horrible thing, it's not, you know, the world shouldn't do that, they'll just die. And that's
but what
not
skills will they need? That's the question, isn't it?
It's going to be engineering, mathematical, you know, sort of computer-driven skills. And the world has moved towards computer-driven skills. That's what, you know, my children, I look at them, I've said, what do you want to be in? In fact, my son now works for the company. He's a developer. It's all about computer science. And that's the area you've got to be specialist in.
Anna?
Yeah, and I would add to that slightly. So I do agree with that. And I also completely agree about AI being just part of our lives going forward, and we just need to get on with that. I see it as a huge opportunity for a lot of things. But I also think the skills that our people will need are the things that computers can't do.
Absolutely.
Which for me is relationship building, ability to have a conversation, all of the face-to-face stuff that we've all learned and grown up with. And it's one of the things I actually think about the most when I'm thinking about our hybrid working, and how do I make sure my people still have all of those human skills that, if anything, are going to be more important than they ever were once AI is adopted mainstream. Super important.
Completely agree.
I think there'll be a large amount of projects, time, money wasted over the next few years because AI projects fail for two reasons. One, because they're not pointed at a use case that actually will have an impact, and two, because people won't talk to each other. So completely agree with you there.
Yeah.
On that note, we must wrap up. I think the discussions have reflected very well both the challenge and the uncertainty, but also some very, very encouraging experience. Thank you to the panel, and thank you very much for your questions.